Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of the Future Tech Podcast. It's me, Charlie Sell, Board Director at Major Group, where I get a chance to speak, interview, have open conversations with the most interesting people within the technology space. As always, it's sponsored by the STEM Ambassador Association and it's shared across our network for all those many listeners looking at trying to find out more about careers within STEM. So I'm really pleased to have Simon Wardley with me today. Simon is a researcher for DXC Technology. For those who don't know DXC Technology, they're a global technology consultancy. But more interestingly, Simon is the inventor of the Wardley mapping, which he will give us a bit more information about and talk a bit about throughout the podcast. So, Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me here. Absolute delight.
And let's jump straight in. Tell us a bit about your story. How did you get into the world of technology?
Gosh, by accident, I think is the short version. The long version. So I went to a comprehensive school, and where we used to have these wonderful computer systems which would tell you what your career would be, and my choice was to join the army or become work in the fire brigade, and which is very, very noble careers. No disagreement with them at all. But I had some very inspiring teachers who encouraged me, and I ended up going to Cambridge and studying natural sciences. So, which was pretty amazing. I'm very grateful for that. And at Cambridge, I specialised in it was genetics basically. So I left Cambridge with natural sciences, specialised in genetics, and then I started working in the environmental field. And just around that time in the 1990s, we had a bit of an economic blip. So the environmental field just sort of went off the cliff, because whenever we have economic blips, the environment, people stop caring about it. And so I went off and did a master's up in Glasgow, and I came back to London, and it was a pretty miserable time for trying to find jobs and things like that. And so I ended up being a trader working towards being a trader. I was clerking on Life, London International Financial Futures Exchange, which is all about trading money, which I have to say was the most boring job I've ever done in my life. I mean, it was awful. So it didn't last long. And then a friend of mine said, you used to do stuff with computers, didn't you? And I said, well, yeah, I've used them for modeling and all the rest of it. And they said they had this problem with a system in Poland, and could I go and have a look? And it was just like, wow. And that started a journey. So I arrived there by pure accident. And I ended up building companies and selling companies, and then speaking at events and talking all around the world and all this sort of stuff. And ended up developing a method of, I should say, Wardley mapping, which is a method of understanding the technology space that you're actually operating in. So, I'd like to think I had a career path and a plan and could give people advice on that sort of stuff. But mine was a pure random accident, just one thing to another. And most importantly, trying to do things that I enjoyed doing. I find it so always, if you find yourself working for a boutique moneymaker, earning lots of money doing something you completely do not love, go find something else, because just life is not worth it. So, but I've ended up in this mapping space, which is bizarre because the mapping is all about the evolution of technology, and that's where I started in genetics. So I've got to say, it is. It ended up coming full circle. So I'm so pleased I did genetics and studied science.
Yeah, wow. And I love that. I mean, there's one nugget of just brilliant advice, I guess, for our listeners, which is obviously definitely do something you enjoy. Life is too short to, as we said, to work for a paycheck or not to be stretched. But it feels to me like you also you're willing to take risks. You've tried different things. You've built companies. You've created your own mapping. You've now researching. How how's that journey gone for you in regards? Was any of it planned, or has it more been about networking? How have you navigated those different opportunities?
So one of the things, this might sound quite bizarre, but um, a lot of my work is about, well, almost all my work is about mapping, and mapping is an imperfect exercise. So what I mean by that is, if you think about a geographical map of somewhere like Paris, in order to create a perfect map of Paris, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of Paris. And as a map, that would be useless. All right. So all maps are imperfect representations of a space, and they have to be in order to be useful, because you can't carry Paris around in your back pocket or whatever. Well, maybe you can on a phone, but it would be just all maps, in order to be useful, have to be imperfect representations. And so you get used to imperfection a lot. And so one of the things about my career, I mean, we talk about it as being random. It's full of lots of imperfection. And that's not a bad thing. I often find people talk about they want to be perfect at something, the pursuit of perfect, getting it just right. But the problem is the pursuit of perfect means you tend to repeat the same activity over and over and over and over and over again to get it just right, which tends to have makes you less flexible, makes you less capable of coping with uncertainty, because you just don't get used to it. You sort of almost, you can become somewhat institutionalized to ways of doing things. So the randomness of my career, I don't actually see as a weakness. I see it actually as somewhat quite useful. And particularly, the research that I do these days is continuously changing subjects as well, and that's a good thing as well. So, if you're going to ask me for career advice for people, the only thing, don't fear imperfection. Don't try to be perfect. Understand you're going to fail. If you're doing anything new, you're going to fail. And that's okay. I mean, I've probably got a guitar somewhere behind me. I've been learning to play the guitar for about the last, I say play, torture, I think is a fair description of what I actually do with the instrument. And most of the reason why I'm still torturing the device is I have a fear of being rubbish. And of course I'm rubbish. Because I haven't put the effort into it and everything else. So that, it's embracing the fact that when you start at something, you're going to fail, and that's okay. And failure itself is not a bad thing. And in fact, we learn a lot from failure, so that's a good thing as well. And overall, life is imperfect, life is uncertain, life is full of failure. Embracing those things, being willing to adapt to those things, is helpful.
And yeah, what a brilliant point, because that fear of failure can hold people back, can't it? It can become your biggest blocker.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you say, and it's amazing how different societies, different cultures, different countries put different levels of importance on this. And some of the most entrepreneurial countries in the world, people have been bankrupt 2 or 3 times if they've been.
But also keep in mind what it is that you want to do. In terms of what you love, okay. Try and make it about what you love, what you really enjoy. A friend of mine, I used to work for a company called Free-to-Lay, which part of the whole Pepsi group. And a friend of mine who was a financial controller there, when he retired, he tells this story. He retired to a very, very nice area in the US with a lovely river and all the rest of it as well. And he tells the story about, how he was fishing on this river. And there was this chap, very scruffy, very messy, unkempt, but he was fishing as well. And so they got chatting, and he told him his life story working for Free-to-Lay. He travelled the world, all the hours he put in and everything else. Several ulcers, a couple of heart attacks, a divorce later and everything else, blah. He eventually had amassed so much money that he could retire and spend his final days sitting on the riverbank fishing. And so he asked the other chap, who was very, very scruffy and very messy, what have you done with your life? And he said, I've just been here fishing. So the point of the story is, do try and pursue things you love.
Yeah.
Okay? Don't spend your life going, this is what I really want to do, but I need to make loads and loads of money before I can do that thing. You can almost generally find a way to do the thing that you love. Okay? Or you should strive to. And of course, some people have vastly more privilege than others. I was brought up by my grandparents very young on a council estate in London, and then moved down to Southend, and then a place in the countryside called Alderware. I went to comprehensive and everything else. I had some privilege over others.
Yeah.
And some people have huge amounts of privilege, so just be mindful of that, but try and pursue what it is that you actually love, and don't be afraid of failure, because failure means you're learning usually, so it's a good
thing. Picking up on the point you just mentioned, because this is so important for this podcast, where we're trying to reach out to people who don't have the stereotypical path into STEM, which at the moment is highly educated and then can afford university, can afford, to go into these things. And that story you just mentioned, raised by your grandparents, you went to a comprehensive, yet you were able to get into Cambridge and you have been able to pursue it. Is there any tips, anything along the way that if there's someone in that similar position listening to this podcast where they think, I can't get into a top red brick university because I don't have those advantages, how did you navigate it, or what do you see in today's world that people can actually maybe be able to achieve those same things?
Gosh. So I was very fortunate because of teachers who helped and pushed me. So first thing, listen to your teachers. I mean, it sounds like that. It's like, why do I want to listen to them? I was terribly rude as a young child to one of my teachers, but I did listen to them, and I'm very grateful for them as well. I find listening to others always good. So one of the things I'm known as the inventor of Wardley mapping. So mapping is a process of we compete over multiple different landscapes. One about, territorial. So territorial landscapes, and you get territorial maps. But we also compete over economic, technological, political, and social spaces as well. All of those can be mapped. Most of them aren't. Even technological and economic spaces, we don't actually have maps of those. There are ways of mapping it, but just very few know how to do this. I actually teach this stuff now at places like London School of Economics, which sounds really bizarre. But I was running a company, and I realized I was competing in a space with others. And I started to think about, how do I map the space? And I realized I had no maps. And so I sort of thought, this is what you learnt at business schools. It turns out you don't. And I had no real way of... I sort of had an inkling it was important. But I had no real way of actually mapping it out. And I ended up in a bookstore in Charing Cross, and the bookseller, I got talking to the person. We were talking about strategy, and I was running a company. I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. I mean, and she asked me, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? And I hadn't. And so she persuaded me, being a good bookseller, to buy 2 different versions of the book, because they're all translations. And I was really grateful, actually, for that moment, because it was in reading the second book I noticed this pattern, which talked about understanding your landscape, understanding the climatic patterns, the heavens, the weather, how the landscape changes, understanding principles of organization, understanding leadership and gameplay, and having a purpose, a moral imperative to get something done. And this particular piece of work led me on a path which led me to mapping out a way of mapping out the environment, and which now has spread around the world, is used by all sorts of different companies. It's quite amazing. And that all really stems from just listening to the bookser.
Yeah, wow.
And so I, if I hadn't listened to them, I would certainly not have gone down that path. And so I've generally found in my life that listening to people and from all walks of life is really, really important, because it's amazing. I mean, the ideas and the revelations you get from others. So if I would encourage you to do anything, don't worry. Don't worry about failure, because it's a good thing. Because it means you're learning. Embrace uncertainty. There's always going to be a bit of chaos in your life. That's okay. Listen to others. Because wisdom comes from all sorts of different places. Try to pursue a path of what it is in your heart, what you really enjoy. That can be difficult at times. I certainly understand the need to make money. I mean, I've lived on friends' couches, I've been without home and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it can be tough at points, but try and pursue. And I suppose that's about it. I mean, I pursued a path into, I started down a path of science. And that's because I was helped by teachers. I listened to my teachers, and they helped me along that path. I mean, but I got into mapping because of a bookseller. I got into computing because a friend asked me to come to Poland. And I was willing to take that gamble, take that risk. So I suppose that's all I can give.
Well, Simon, thank you so much. That has been such an interesting conversation, and just hearing your story. But and there I was busy jotting down your key takeaways, which you just elegantly summarised for me. So that's been perfect, because what's so lovely when speaking with people like yourself and many of my other guests is that diversity of backgrounds, but also that diversity of experience. And there isn't one path for every person, and there shouldn't be one path. And just hearing how you've been so open to talk about the fear of failure, not the fear of failure, being willing to fail and different times, and learning and listening to teachers. And
I have a fear of failure, but I'm just willing
to do it.
No, but it's a bit like, you always, it's like when you pick up the guitar for the first time, you go, oh my God, I'm going to be terrible. Yes, you are going to be terrible. Accept it. You have to get through that.
Yeah. Well,
and it's good to fail at a lot of things, because it means you're learning.
Yeah, so thank you. I think there's some really, really lovely takeaways there. And can you believe it? Time flies when you've got such interesting topics. And so, Simon, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Delight to be here, and thank you so much for asking.
Fantastic. And to our listeners, that is another episode of the Future Tech Podcast. As I mentioned, the podcast is shared across the STEM Ambassador Association, also on our website, majorgroup.com/podcasts, and on our Spotify channel. So one more time, a massive thank you to Simon. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to Future Tech.